The red earth of Dahomey still remembers her. If you press your ear against the ground near the old palace ruins at Abomi, some say you can hear fragments of a melody that was never meant to exist. A song born from chains. A song that learned to kill. Have you ever wondered what happens when someone takes everything from a person except their voice? When the only thing left unbroken is the throat that screams. Tonight, I want to tell you about a woman whose name the royal scribes tried to erase from every record, whose songs the priests forbade anyone to repeat, whose memory the kings of Dahomey attempted to bury beneath layers of silence and fear. But here is the thing about voices. They travel. They echo. They survive. What you are about to hear is not simply a story of revenge. It is the chronicle of how one woman transformed the very weapon of her oppression into the instrument of her liberation. How she stood in the center of power, surrounded by those who believed they owned her completely, and she sang, and her singing changed everything. If you have ever felt voiceless, powerless, invisible, this story will remind you that even the smallest sound can become thunder. Even the gentlest melody can shake foundations. Before we begin, I want you to do something for me. If you believe that truth should never be silenced, if you think the stories of the forgotten deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. Because this channel exists to resurrect the voices history tried to bury. Now let me take you back to a kingdom built on blood, where a woman named Adayeze discovered that her voice was the most dangerous weapon ever created. The walls of the royal compound at Abomi still stand in fragments, scattered across the landscape like broken teeth in the mouth of a dying god. Tourists walk among them now, snapping photographs, reading plaques that sanitize centuries of violence into digestible paragraphs suitable for educational consumption. They do not know what these stones witnessed. In the dry season, when the Harmattan winds blow down from the Sahara carrying sand and whispers, the local people avoid certain sections of the old palace grounds after sunset. They say the wind carries sounds that should not exist anymore. Fragments of rhythm, pieces of melody. The ghost of a voice that refused to die even after the throat that produced it was silenced. There is a particular courtyard, now overgrown with elephant grass and strangler figs, where nothing grows properly. The soil is different there, darker. The elders say it is because the earth itself absorbed too much blood, too much sorrow, too much song. This is not a story about victims. The word victim implies passivity, acceptance, surrender. What unfolded in this kingdom during the reign of King Tegbesu was something far more complex and infinitely more terrifying to those in power. This is the account of how captivity itself became a crucible, how degradation forged steel from flesh, how a woman transformed her chains into a garrote that strangled an empire's sense of invincibility. The kingdom of Dahomey in 1751 stood at the apex of its power. The annual customs, those elaborate festivals of sacrifice and display, drew observers from across the continent and beyond. European traders anchored their ships at Whydah and Jachin, eager to exchange guns and cloth and rum for human beings. The palace at Abomey sprawled across the plateau like a living organism, its walls constructed from the red laterite clay mixed, some claimed, with the blood of enemies and the palm oil that greased the wheels of commerce. King Tegbesu, third of his line, ruled from a throne carved from the skulls of defeated rivals. His Amazon warriors, the Mino, patrolled the borders and guarded his person with a ferocity that made grown men whisper. The kingdom's wealth flowed from a single source, endless and seemingly inexhaustible. Human beings, captured in raids, sold to ships, transformed into profit. But even the most perfect systems contain their own destruction. Even the most absolute power produces its own opposition. And sometimes, that opposition takes a form no one anticipates. Adayeze arrived in Dahomey in the belly of a war canoe, her wrists bound with rope braided from palm fiber, her throat raw from screaming curses in a language her captors did not understand. She was not Fawn, not from the conquering people. She came from the east, from among the Igbo, from a village that no longer existed because Dahomey's warriors had erased it from the earth in a single night of fire and blood. She was 23 years old. She had been a wife. She had been a mother. She had been the daughter of a titled man, a woman of standing in her community, a keeper of songs. That last detail would prove to be the most important, the most dangerous. the most fatal. Among her people, Adesi had served as one of the women who maintained the oral traditions, who memorized the genealogies and the histories, who sang at funerals and festivals and births. Her voice was not merely beautiful, it was trained, disciplined, capable of ranges and techniques that most people could not achieve after decades of practice. She could modulate tone to convey emotion that bypassed the intellect and struck directly at the heart. She could sustain notes that seemed to last forever, that hung in the air like visible things, that made listeners forget to breathe. The raiders who burned her village and killed her husband and dragged her children away to separate fates did not know what they were capturing. They saw only another body, another commodity, another entry in the ledgers of human commerce. They would learn differently. They would learn too late. If you want to accompany more cases like this one, cases that disturbed entire societies and revealed hidden truths, subscribe to this channel so you do not miss any investigation. The royal compound at Abomi covered an area larger than many European cities of the era. It was not a single building, but a constellation of structures, each serving different functions in the complex machinery of absolute monarchy. There were quarters for the king's hundreds of wives, barracks for the Amazon warriors, storehouses for tribute collected from vassal states, shrines to the Vodun spirits who allegedly blessed the dynasty. And there were the spaces reserved for ceremonies, those elaborate performances of power designed to remind everyone who ruled and who obeyed. King Tegbesu inherited from his predecessors an obsession with spectacle. The annual customs known as Shwetanu lasted for weeks and consumed resources that could have fed villages for years. Captives were paraded through the streets. Enemies were executed in public displays designed to demonstrate the consequences of resistance. And music filled every moment, because music was how the Fon people communicated with their ancestors, with their gods, with the forces that allegedly legitimized the kingdom's existence. The palace maintained a corps of singers and drummers, whose sole function was to provide the soundtrack to power. They performed at state occasions. They accompanied sacrifices. They sang the praises of the king in compositions that detailed his magnificence, his victories, his divine right to rule over all he surveyed. Among these performers, there existed a hierarchy as rigid as any other in the kingdom. At the bottom were the captives, the enslaved people from other nations who had been pressed into service because they possessed talents the palace required. They were property, no different legally than the carved stools or woven textiles that decorated the royal chambers. They existed to serve. Their existence had no other meaning. Adais arrived at the palace approximately 6 months after her capture. The intervening period had been spent in a holding compound near the coast, where she and hundreds of others awaited sorting. Some would be sold to the Europeans and their ships. Others would be kept for domestic slavery within Dahomey itself. The selection process was brutal in its efficiency, its total disregard for the people it classified. A court official named Kangla oversaw the evaluation of new captives for palace service. He was a heavy-set man with eyes that missed nothing, a eunuch who had risen to considerable influence through decades of faithful service and ruthless competence. He walked among the captives like a farmer examining livestock, noting physical condition, estimating age, assessing potential usefulness. When he reached Adais, he almost passed her by. She was thin from months of poor nutrition, her hair matted, her skin marked by the conditions of her confinement. She looked like what she was supposed to be: defeated, broken, resigned. Then someone spoke. One of the guards mentioned that this one had been heard singing to herself in the nights, when she thought no one was listening. Strange songs, foreign melodies, a voice that carried through walls. Kapengla stopped. He turned. He looked at Adese with new interest. "Sing," he commanded in Fon. The word was simple. The tone allowed no negotiation. Adese understood enough by then to know what was being demanded. She considered refusing. She considered silence as its own form of resistance. But something in her, some instinct for survival that operated beneath conscious thought, made her open her mouth. What emerged was a lullaby, the one she used to sing to her children, the one her mother had sung to her. The melody was simple, traditional, unremarkable to anyone who did not understand the language. But the voice that delivered it was anything but ordinary. Kapengla stood motionless for the duration. When she finished, he turned to his assistant and spoke rapidly in Fawn. The words meant nothing to Ades at the time. She would learn their significance later. This one goes to the palace. The king himself will want to hear this voice. Within days, Ades found herself transported from the coastal holding compound to the heart of Dahamian power. She was given better food, clothing that was not rags, a place to sleep that was not exposed dirt. These improvements were not kindness. They were maintenance, preservation of an asset. She was about to become an instrument, a tool, a possession whose value derived entirely from what her throat could produce. And she was about to begin learning how to transform that instrument into something else entirely. The palace singer corps consisted of approximately 40 individuals when Ades joined their ranks. Most were born Fawn, or had been assimilated so thoroughly over generations of captivity that their original identities had been erased. They spoke the language of the court. They understood the protocols. They knew which Vodun spirits required which songs, which ancestors demanded which rhythms, which occasions called for celebration, and which demanded mourning. Ades knew none of this. She was foreign in every way. Her features were different, the scarification patterns marking her as Igbo rather than Fawn. Her language was incomprehensible to most of the other singers. Her musical traditions came from an entirely different cultural universe, shaped by different histories, different beliefs, different understandings of what sound could accomplish. The head of the singer corps was a woman named Huanjile. She had been born in the palace, daughter of a previous generation of captive performers, and she had risen to her position through a combination of genuine talent and political survival skills honed over decades. Huanjil understood the palace the way a fish understands water. She knew its currents, its dangers, its hidden depths where predators lurked. She was also the first person to recognize what Ades actually was. It happened during a training session, approximately 2 weeks after Ades's arrival. The new captive was being taught the basic ceremonial songs, the ones performed at routine palace functions. The melodies were simple enough to learn. The words were meaningless sounds to Ades, but she had always possessed the ability to reproduce what she heard with near-perfect accuracy. The training master was satisfied with her progress. She would be adequate, functional. Another voice in the chorus. Huanjile observed from a distance, her attention initially occupied by other concerns. Then something made her look more closely. Some quality in the way Ades produced sound. Some characteristic that went beyond mere mimicry. "Wait," Huanjile commanded. She approached Ades. The other singers fell silent. "Sing again." The last phrase. Ades complied. The phrase was unremarkable, a conventional melodic pattern used in dozens of ceremonial compositions. But the way she sang it was not conventional. There was a quality, difficult to describe in words, that transcended technical proficiency. The notes seemed to acquire weight, substance, physical presence in the air. The phrase lingered after she finished, echoing not in the ears but somewhere deeper, somewhere visceral. Huanjile understood immediately. She had encountered perhaps 3 other voices like this in her decades of service. Voices that did not merely produce music, but channeled something else, something larger, something that affected listeners in ways that went beyond conscious perception. The Fawn had a word for this quality. They called it the spirit voice. The voice that could carry messages between the human world and the realm of the ancestors. The voice that could command attention from beings who were not mortal. It was a gift. It was also a danger. Because voices like this could not be controlled in the usual ways. They could not be limited to conventional functions. They had power that existed independent of the person who possessed them. Huanjil made a decision in that moment that would have consequences neither she nor anyone else could anticipate. She decided to protect this foreign woman, to train her properly, to ensure that she survived long enough for her gift to develop fully. Whether this decision was born from compassion or calculation, or something else entirely, Huanjile herself probably could not have said. Perhaps she recognized in Ades something of herself, the brilliant stranger forced to adapt to survive. Perhaps she simply could not bear to see such a voice wasted on inadequate training. Perhaps the ancestors themselves guided her hand. Regardless of motivation, Huanjile began giving Ades private instruction. Late at night, When the other singers slept and the palace corridors fell silent, the two women would meet in a small storage room adjacent to the singers' quarters. There, by the light of a single palm oil lamp, Huanjili taught Adaisi things that were not supposed to be shared with foreigners. She taught her the secret songs, the ones reserved for the most sacred ceremonies, the ones that allegedly held actual power, that could summon spirits and bend reality and speak to the dead. She taught her the history behind each melody, which king had commissioned it, what occasion it commemorated, what sacrifices had accompanied its first performance. She taught her the language, not just enough fond to follow commands, but enough to understand nuance, to grasp implication, to comprehend what was really being said beneath the surface of courtly speech. And she taught her, without ever stating it directly, that knowledge was the only weapon a captive truly possessed. The more Adais understood about the palace, about the kingdom, about the people who held her in bondage, the greater her chances of surviving long enough for circumstances to change. What Huanjile did not anticipate was how quickly Adais would absorb these lessons, how completely she would master the secret songs, how thoroughly she would come to understand the palace and its inhabitants. And she certainly did not anticipate what Adais would eventually do with all this knowledge. Please leave in the comments, never give up on truth, if you believe that justice should reach all the oppressed. The first time Adais sang before King Tegbesu, she understood what it meant to stand in the presence of absolute power. The throne room was not a room at all, but an open courtyard, shaded by awnings of imported European cloth and decorated with objects designed to overwhelm the senses. Carved ivories, woven silks. The skulls of enemies arranged in patterns that spelled out the king's praise names. The throne itself, elevated on a platform and surrounded by offerings to the royal ancestors. Tegbesu was not what she had expected. The stories painted him as a giant, a demon, a figure of almost supernatural menace. The reality was a man of perhaps 50 years, heavy-set, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He sat perfectly still while the singers performed, his expression revealing nothing, his attention apparently elsewhere. But Adaisi noticed that when her voice rose above the others, when her particular quality became distinguishable from the general chorus, Tegbesu's eyes found her, fixed on her, remained there until the performance concluded. Afterward, Kapengla approached Huanjile. The king wishes to know who the foreign voice belongs to. It was not a question, it was a notification. Adaisi's existence had been registered by the only person whose attention truly mattered. From that day forward, her status within the palace changed. Not dramatically, not in ways that violated the fundamental structure of her captivity. She was still property. She still slept in the singers' quarters and ate the food allotted to performers and wore the clothing distributed by the palace stores. But the other captives treated her differently. The guards spoke to her with less contempt. She was assigned to increasingly important ceremonies. Her voice featured more prominently, her presence requested specifically for occasions when the king himself would attend. This preferential treatment came with dangers that Adaisi learned to navigate carefully. Jealousy from other singers who resented her rapid advancement. Suspicion from palace officials who wondered why a foreign captive was receiving such attention. And attention itself, from men who saw her as newly valuable and therefore newly desirable. She dealt with each challenge as it arose, drawing on reserves of resilience she had not known she possessed. The woman who had screamed curses from the war canoe had transformed, not into submission but into something more calculated, more patient, more dangerous. Because Adaisi had not forgotten. Not her husband, murdered defending their home. Not her children, torn from her arms and sold to separate fates. Not her village, erased from existence as casually as a man might brush dust from his clothing. Not any of it. She remembered everything, and she used that memory as fuel. The palace became her classroom. Every ceremony she attended taught her something about the structure of power. Every conversation she overheard revealed relationships and rivalries and weaknesses. Every sacred song she learned carried information about the beliefs that allegedly legitimized the kingdom's existence. She discovered that Dahome's power rested on foundations more fragile than its overwhelming military might suggested. The kingdom was not a unified entity, but a collection of conquered peoples held together by force and fear. The annual customs, those spectacular displays of royal power, existed not merely to impress but to intimidate, to remind everyone that resistance meant death. She learned that King Tegbisu, despite his apparent invincibility, faced constant challenges, from brothers who coveted his throne, from generals who commanded armies theoretically loyal to the crown, from priests who controlled access to the gods and ancestors whose blessing the king supposedly enjoyed, from the European traders whose weapons and wealth had become essential to the kingdom's military dominance. She learned that the palace itself was a nest of conspiracies, everyone scheming against everyone else, alliances forming and dissolving with bewildering speed, loyalty extending only as far as self-interest permitted. And she learned, most importantly, that the ceremonies she was required to perform had meanings far deeper than she had initially understood. The sacred songs were not merely entertainment. They were, according to the beliefs of those who created them, actual conduits of power. The right voice singing the right words at the right moment could allegedly influence the outcome of battles, determine the success of harvests, ensure the king's health, guarantee the kingdom's prosperity. The Fawn believed in the power of the voice with an intensity that bordered on the absolute. Words were not merely symbols representing things. Words were things, possessing reality independent of the objects they described. Songs were not merely combinations of words and melody. Songs were living entities, capable of acting on the world, of shaping reality according to the will of those who created and performed them. This was why the palace maintained such an elaborate corps of singers. This was why performances were surrounded by such elaborate protocols and restrictions. This was why certain songs were forbidden outside specific contexts, their power allegedly too dangerous to be released carelessly. And this was why a voice like a daisy's was so valuable. A voice that could carry messages between worlds. A voice that could speak to ancestors and spirits. A voice that possessed what the Fawn called the spirit quality. It was also, Adayezi began to realize, why such a voice could be so dangerous. If the songs possessed actual power, if the ceremonies actually influenced reality, if the voice actually served as a conduit between the human and the divine, then what happened when that conduit was controlled by someone who did not share the beliefs of those who created it? What happened when the voice began singing something other than what it was commanded to sing? The year 1751 was marked by particularly elaborate annual customs. King Tegbesu had recently achieved a significant military victory against a neighboring kingdom, and the ceremonies were designed to celebrate this triumph and to process the hundreds of captives who had been taken during the campaign. The customs lasted for weeks, beginning in late November when the dry season made travel feasible and the harvest had been completed. They included parades, sacrifices, distributions of gifts, performances of songs and dances, and public executions designed to demonstrate the consequences of opposing Dahomeyan power. Adeze was required to participate in nearly every major ceremony. Her voice had become associated in the king's mind with success. He believed, or professed to believe, that her performances brought blessing from the ancestors, that her sound pleased the spirits, that her presence at important occasions ensured favorable outcomes. This belief gave Adeze access she had never anticipated. She stood in the inner courtyard during the most sacred rituals. She witnessed the private ceremonies that occurred before the public spectacles. She heard conversations that were not intended for captive ears, discussions of policy and strategy that revealed the inner workings of royal decision-making. She watched the sacrifices, not as a distant observer, but as a performer positioned just steps away from the execution ground. She saw the faces of those about to die, heard their final words, witnessed the moment when life became absence. Many of the victims were from her own people. Igbo captives from recent raids, taken from villages similar to her own, destined for death because the annual customs required blood to satisfy the ancestors. There was one ceremony in particular that would change everything. It occurred during the third week of the customs, on a date selected by the priests as especially auspicious for communicating with the dead. The king was required to offer a significant number of sacrifices, and the ceremony was to be accompanied by the most sacred songs, performed by the best voices in the palace corps. Adayezi was positioned at the front of the singers, closest to the execution ground. She had been given the primary melodic line, the most important part, the voice that would carry the message to the ancestors. The victims were brought forward in groups. Most were men, warriors captured in recent campaigns, their dignity maintained despite their impending deaths. They walked without resistance, some of them singing their own songs, their own death songs, their own communications with their own ancestors. Then a group of women was brought forward. Young women, some barely past childhood, all bearing the facial scarification of the Igbo people. Adaeze's people. Among them was a face she recognized. The recognition did not come immediately. The woman was thin, changed by the months of captivity, her features altered by suffering. But something in the way she held herself, some gesture or posture or quality of movement, triggered a cascade of memory. This was Chiamaka, her sister's daughter. The girl she had helped raise after her sister died in childbirth. The girl who had been like a daughter to her. The girl she had not seen since that night of fire and blood, when her village ceased to exist. Chiamaka was going to die. Here. Now. While Adaeze sang the songs that would allegedly carry her soul to the ancestors who would receive her blood as offering. Something broke inside Adaeze in that moment. Not her will, not her determination, not her careful patience. Something else. Some barrier she had constructed to contain the enormity of her grief. Some wall she had built to separate her former self from the person she had been forced to become. She was supposed to sing. The ceremony demanded it. The other singers had begun the preparatory phrases, the musical introduction that would lead into the main sacrificial song. Her voice was expected to join theirs, to take the lead, to carry the melody that would accompany the killing. She opened her mouth. What emerged was not the song she had been commanded to sing. It was a different song, an Igbo song, a lament for the dead that she had learned as a child, that had been passed down through generations of her people, that belonged to a world the Faun had tried to destroy. The other singers faltered. The drummers hesitated. The ceremony stumbled to a halt as everyone tried to understand what was happening. Adaeze kept singing. Her voice, that powerful instrument that the king himself prized, poured out the forbidden melody with an intensity she had never displayed before. The sound filled the courtyard, seemed to expand beyond its physical boundaries, seemed to penetrate walls and bodies and the very air itself. Chiamaka looked up, recognized the song, recognized the voice, recognized, perhaps, who was singing. Their eyes met across the blood-soaked ground. Aunt and niece. Past and present. The living and the soon-to-be dead. Adaeze sang the entire lament. It lasted only a few minutes, though it seemed to stretch into eternity. When she finished, the courtyard was completely silent. Even the king, who had observed the entire disruption without visible reaction, said nothing. Then the guards moved forward. Adaeze was seized, dragged from her position among the singers, thrown to the ground before the throne. Tegbesu looked down at her. His expression was unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost conversational. That was not the song you were commanded to sing. No, Adaeze replied. Her fawn was adequate to express what she needed to say. It was the song my people sing for our dead. She deserved to hear it before she died. Tegbesu considered this response for a long moment. The courtyard remained frozen, everyone waiting to learn what punishment would follow this unprecedented transgression. Finally, the king spoke again. You will be punished, but you will not die. Your voice is too valuable to waste. However, you will learn what happens to those who defy my commands. And you will never forget this lesson. What followed was brutal. Adaeze was beaten in public, not enough to cause permanent damage to her voice, but enough to make the point unmistakably clear. She was confined to isolation for weeks, given only enough food and water to survive. She was forbidden from participating in any ceremony until the king himself decided she had sufficiently learned her place. And Chiamaka was executed along with the other victims, her death neither hastened nor delayed by her aunt's intervention. The ceremony concluded as planned. The ancestors received their offerings. The customs continued without further disruption. But something had changed. Something had shifted in the balance of power so subtly that only those paying very close attention would notice. The other captives had witnessed Adaeze's defiance. They had seen someone stand before absolute power and refuse to comply. They had heard a voice raised, not in service to the oppressor, but in honor of the oppressed. Word spread through the palace, through the compounds where captives lived, through the networks of communication that connected enslaved people across the kingdom. A foreign woman had sung a forbidden song at the most sacred ceremony of the year. She had honored her dead when she was supposed to honor the king's power. She had survived. Adais did not know it yet, but she had just taken the first step towards something far larger than personal revenge. She had just planted a seed that would grow into something the kingdom of Dahomey had never faced before. She had just begun to transform her voice into a weapon. The months following her punishment were a time of transformation for Adais, though the transformation occurred entirely beneath the surface of apparent submission. She resumed her duties as a palace singer after her period of isolation ended. She performed the songs she was commanded to perform, her voice as powerful as ever, her obedience seemingly restored. But she had changed. The woman who returned to the singer's quarters was not the same woman who had been dragged from the ceremonial courtyard. Something in her eyes had hardened. Something in her demeanor had shifted from reactive to calculating. Wangile noticed the change immediately. The older woman had kept her distance during Adisi's punishment, unwilling to jeopardize her own position by association. But she had also protected Adisi in subtle ways, ensuring that rumors of the foreign woman's defiance did not become accusations of broader conspiracy, that Adisi's isolation did not become permanent disappearance. Now, watching her protégé move through the palace corridors with new purpose, Wangile felt both pride and fear. Pride in what she had helped create. Fear of what that creation might become. One night, weeks after Adisi's return to duty, Wangile requested a private meeting. They met in their usual location, the storage room lit by a single lamp, the palace sleeping around them. "You have a plan," Wangile said. It was not a question. Adais looked at her teacher for a long moment before responding. "I have begun to understand something," she said carefully. "About the songs. About what they are supposed to do." Wangile waited. "The priests and the king believe the sacred songs have power," Adais continued. "They believe my voice, specifically, has the quality that allows the songs to work, as they are intended, to carry messages to the ancestors, to influence events, to shape reality. This is what I have taught you," Wangile acknowledged. "This is what the palace believes. But here is what I have realized," Adais said, leaning forward, her voice dropping even lower. "If the songs have power, and if my voice gives them that power, then who controls what the songs actually do?" Wangile's eyes widened. She understood immediately what Adais was suggesting. The implications were staggering. "You are saying," Wangile whispered, "that you could sing the words they command you to sing, but make the songs do something else? Something other than what they intend?" "I am saying," Adais replied, "that I have been experimenting, in small ways. During ceremonies that are not closely watched, I have been adding things to the songs, removing things, changing the intent behind the words while keeping the words themselves the same. And what has happened?" Adais allowed herself a small, cold smile. "Things have gone wrong for certain people, minor problems, accidents that could be coincidence, but too many coincidences when I began to pay attention. A guard who beat me particularly badly during my punishment fell from a height and broke his leg. A priest who argued that I should be executed for my transgression developed a wasting illness. Small things, but noticeable things." Wangile sat back, her mind racing. What Adais was describing was either madness or revolution. Perhaps both. "You understand what you are risking," Wangile said finally. "If anyone suspects what you are doing, you will not survive. The punishments for misusing sacred songs are far worse than what you have already experienced." "I understand," Adais replied. "But I have also come to understand something else. I am going to die here regardless. Whether in a year or in 30 years, I will die a captive. My children are lost to me. My people are being destroyed. Everything I loved has been taken." She paused, her eyes reflecting the lamp flame. "So the question becomes, What do I do with the time remaining? Do I serve those who destroyed my world? Or do I use whatever power I possess to strike back? It was a question Huanjile had avoided asking herself for decades. The question every captive ultimately faced, but most chose to answer through accommodation, survival, the small dignities that could be preserved within the structure of bondage. But Adaiz was not offering accommodation. She was offering something else entirely. Something that terrified Huanjile even as it stirred something long dormant in her own heart. "I cannot help you directly," Huanjile said finally, "but I will not stop you, and I will teach you what else you need to know. There are songs I have not yet shared with you, songs whose power is greater than anything you have yet learned, songs that were created for purposes that the current priests have forgotten or suppressed." "Why would you do this?" Adaizi asked. "You have survived here for so long by being careful, by not taking risks. Why help me now?" Huanjile was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Because I was like you once. Young, angry, ready to burn the world if I could. And then I became afraid. I learned to survive instead of resist." She looked at Adaiz with something like hunger. "Perhaps I want to see what would have happened if I had been braver. Perhaps I want to know if resistance is actually possible, even if I am too old and too frightened to attempt it myself." It was the most honest thing Huanjile had ever said to her student. Perhaps the most honest thing she had said to anyone in decades. That night marked the beginning of a new phase in Adaizi's education. Over the following months, Huanjile taught her songs that had been removed from the ceremonial repertoire, songs whose power was considered too dangerous for regular use, songs that allegedly could do more than communicate with ancestors, but could command them, could bind them, could turn their power towards specific ends. Adaiz absorbed these lessons with the same speed and completeness she had demonstrated from the beginning. But now she was not merely learning. She was planning. Each new song became a potential weapon. Each new piece of knowledge became a tool in a strategy that was gradually taking shape in her mind. She did not yet know exactly what she would do, but she knew that when the moment came, she would be ready. And she knew that the kingdom of Dahomey, for all its power and wealth and military might, had no idea what was about to happen. The plan that eventually emerged was not a single stroke of revenge, but something more ambitious and more complex. Adaiz understood that she could not destroy the kingdom through individual acts of sabotage. Tegbesu was too powerful, his forces too numerous, his control too complete. Any direct attack would be crushed immediately. But she could do something else. She could undermine the foundation on which the kingdom's power rested. She could attack not the body of Dahomey, but its spirit, its belief in itself, its confidence that the gods and ancestors supported its existence. The key was the sacred songs. The kingdom's legitimacy derived in large part from its relationship with supernatural forces. The annual customs, the daily rituals, the elaborate ceremonies that marked every significant occasion, all existed to maintain that relationship, to demonstrate that the royal dynasty enjoyed divine favor, that Dahomey's power was not merely military, but spiritual. If something went wrong with the ceremonies, if the songs stopped working, if the ancestors began sending signs of displeasure instead of blessing, then the whole structure would begin to tremble. Not collapse immediately, perhaps, but shake, develop cracks, become vulnerable to forces that were already present but contained. Adaiz began her work gradually, testing her capabilities, developing her techniques, building her confidence. During minor ceremonies, she would introduce slight modifications to the songs, alterations so subtle that no one noticed, but that allegedly changed the intent of the performance. She would observe the results, catalog them, refine her approach. The results were encouraging. Minor mishaps began occurring with unusual frequency at events where she performed. A sacrificial animal escaped and had to be pursued through the palace grounds, disrupting a ceremony. A sudden rainstorm developed during a supposedly auspicious occasion, forcing everyone to seek shelter. A dignitary fell ill immediately after a feast that Adaiz had sung at, his illness severe enough to require consultation with the priests. Each incident could be explained as coincidence, but the accumulation of incidents began to create unease. The priests started performing additional divinations, seeking to understand why small things kept going wrong. The king ordered extra sacrifices to propitiate the ancestors who might be displeased. No one suspected the foreign singer. Why would they? She performed her duties faithfully, her voice as magnificent as ever, her demeanor appropriately submissive. The problems must have other sources. Perhaps enemies were working malicious magic. Perhaps the ancestors required more elaborate offerings. Perhaps the stars were poorly aligned. While the palace searched for explanations, Adais continued to build. She had identified potential allies among the other captives, people whose hatred of Dahomey matched her own, people who might be willing to take risks if the opportunity arose. She did not recruit them directly, not yet. The risk of betrayal was too high. But she observed them, learned their stories, assessed their capabilities and their courage. She also built connections beyond the palace walls. The network of captives extended throughout the kingdom, people who communicated through subtle signals, who shared information through songs and stories that seemed innocent to their captors, who maintained identities and histories that bondage had not been able to erase. Adais began incorporating messages into her performances. Not the powerful songs that affected events, but simple communications, information shared through melodic patterns that only those who knew the codes could understand. She told other captives what she was doing, prepared them for what might come, built a web of awareness that spread far beyond Dahomey. The work took years. Adais could not rush without risking detection, without making mistakes that would destroy everything before it had a chance to develop. She performed her duties, maintained her apparent submission, gave no indication that she was anything other than a valuable asset fulfilling her assigned function. But underneath the surface, something was growing. A network, a movement, a collective willingness to act when the moment arrived. And Adais was preparing something else as well, something more direct, something that would strike at the heart of Dahomean power in a way that could not be ignored or explained away. She was preparing the song that would change everything. King Tegbesu died in 1774, after a reign of more than 3 decades. His death came not through Adai's intervention, but through the ordinary processes of mortality. He was an old man by the standards of his era, worn out by decades of rule, his final years marked by illness and incapacity. Adais had been in the palace for over 20 years by then. She was no longer young, no longer the desperate captive who had arrived in chains. She had become an institution, a fixture, a voice so associated with royal ceremonies that imagining the palace without her was difficult. Kings came and went, officials rose and fell. But the foreign singer remained, her voice perhaps slightly deeper than it had been in youth, but no less powerful, no less capable of stirring emotions and allegedly influencing events. Tegbesu's successor was his son Kapengla, named after the eunuch official who had first identified Adai's value. The new king was younger, more aggressive, more committed to expanding Dahomean power through military conquest. He had little patience for the elaborate ceremonial traditions his father had maintained, preferring direct action to symbolic performance. This shift created both danger and opportunity for Adais. The new king cared less about the sacred songs, which meant less attention to what the singers actually performed. But he was also more suspicious, more quick to punish perceived failures, more willing to dispose of anyone who seemed to threaten his authority. The opportunity, though, was significant. Kapengla planned military campaigns that would strain the kingdom's resources and its network of alliances. He intended to attack neighboring states that had previously been left in peace, to capture more slaves to sell to the increasingly hungry European traders, to demonstrate his power in ways that would surpass his father's achievements. These campaigns would require the blessing of the ancestors. They would require elaborate ceremonies, major performances, the most powerful songs in the kingdom's repertoire. They would require Adais. The preparation for Kapengla's first major campaign as king took months. The priests divined the most auspicious dates. The generals gathered their forces. The palace prepared for ceremonies that would dwarf anything performed during Tegbesu's reign. Adais watched these preparations with the patience she had cultivated over 2 decades. She knew that the moment she had been working toward was approaching. She knew that her network was ready, that the captives throughout the kingdom were aware that something was about to happen, that the songs she had been sharing had prepared them for action. She also knew that she might not survive what she was about to do. The consequences of what she planned would be severe, regardless of whether it succeeded or failed. But she had made peace with that possibility long ago. Her life had been taken from her the moment her village burned. Everything since had been borrowed time, used for a purpose larger than her individual survival. The night before the main ceremony, Adise met one final time with Huanjili. The older woman was ancient now, her body failing even as her mind remained sharp. She had watched her students' long preparation with a mixture of awe and terror, knowing that something unprecedented was approaching, unable to predict exactly what form it would take. "Tomorrow," Adise said simply. Huanjile nodded. She had known this moment would come eventually. She had helped make it possible. "What will you do?" she asked. "I will sing," Adise replied. "I will sing the truth." They sat together in silence for a long time. Two women whose lives had been shaped by captivity, whose relationship had been forged in secret, whose futures would be determined by what happened when the sun rose. Then Huanjile did something she had never done before. She reached out and took Adise's hands in her own. "When I die," Huanjile said, "I want to be remembered as someone who helped, someone who did more than survive, someone who made resistance possible, even if I was too afraid to resist myself." She squeezed Adise's hands. "You will give me that. Whatever happens tomorrow, you will give me that." Adise squeezed back. "I will," she promised, "and I will make sure that everyone knows, that the songs remember, that your name survives." They parted knowing they would probably never see each other again. Huanjile was too old and too fragile to attend the next day's ceremony, and if things went as Adise planned, there would be no opportunity for farewell afterward. But the connection remained, the bond between teacher and student, between protector and protected, between two women who had found something like freedom in the prison of the palace. It was enough. The ceremony began at dawn, as the first light touched the red walls of the palace compound. Thousands of people had gathered, nobles and commoners, free and enslaved, warriors preparing for campaign, and priests preparing to bless their enterprise. King Kapengla sat on his throne, surrounded by the symbols of power, ready to receive the ancestral blessing that would ensure his victory. Adise took her position among the singers. She was in the front rank, as she had been for years, her voice the most prominent, her performance the most closely observed. She wore the costume required for such occasions, the white cloth and beaded ornaments that marked her as a sacred performer, a conduit between worlds. The ceremony proceeded through its preliminary phases: lesser songs, minor rituals, the gradual building of spiritual energy that would culminate in the great blessing. Adise performed her parts flawlessly, giving no indication that anything unusual was about to happen. Then the moment arrived. The main song, the Great Blessing Song, the performance that would allegedly determine the success of the entire campaign. The drums began their preparatory rhythm. The other singers hummed the opening tones, all attention focused on Adise, waiting for her to lead the melody that would carry the kingdom's prayers to the ancestors. She opened her mouth, and she sang something else entirely. The song that emerged was not from the Dahomean tradition. It was not from the Igbo tradition either, though elements of both were present. It was something new, something Adise had been composing in secret for years, something that drew on everything she had learned about the power of voice and the structure of sacred music. It was a song of truth. A song that named what the kingdom of Dahomey actually was. A song that spoke of villages burned and children stolen and families destroyed. A song that described the suffering of the captives, the cruelty of the masters, the injustice of the entire system that sustained the kingdom's wealth and power. But it was more than mere description. Adise poured into the song everything she had learned about making words into reality. She shaped the melody to carry not just meaning, but intent. She directed the sound toward the ancestors who were supposed to be listening, but not as supplicant to judge, as accuser to accused. The song demanded that the ancestors witness what was being done in their names. It demanded that they see the suffering their descendants had caused. It demanded that they recognize that the rituals performed to honor them were funded by horror, that the sacrifices offered to them were murders, that the kingdom that claimed their blessing was built on foundations of absolute evil. And then, having made the accusation, the song did something unprecedented. It released the ancestors from their obligation. It declared that no spiritual power was bound to support oppression. It stated that the blessing was withdrawn, that the protection was ended, that the gods themselves had been deceived by those who claimed to serve them. The song lasted approximately 5 minutes. But in those 5 minutes, Adaeze compressed 20 years of preparation, decades of suffering, centuries of injustice into a single sustained act of vocal rebellion. The effect was immediate and devastating. Some of what happened can be explained through natural causes. Adaeze's voice was powerful enough to cause physical reactions in those who heard it. The emotional intensity of the performance affected people on levels below conscious thought. The shock of unexpected content created confusion and fear. But some of what happened exceeded any natural explanation. The sky, which had been clear at dawn, suddenly darkened. Thunder rolled in the distance, though no storm had been predicted. Several people in the crowd collapsed, though they showed no signs of illness before or after. The sacred fire that burned at the center of the ritual ground flickered and nearly went out. And throughout the compound, among the captives who had been waiting for this moment, who had received Adaeze's messages through the network she had built, something else happened. They began to sing as well. Not the same song, but songs from their own peoples, songs of resistance and defiance that had never been heard within the palace walls, songs that rose from hundreds of throats simultaneously in a chaotic, overwhelming cacophony of liberation. The ceremony descended into chaos. The priests did not know what ritual to perform to counter what was happening. The guards did not know who to arrest when seemingly everyone was involved. The king himself sat frozen on his throne, watching his carefully planned blessing disintegrate into something that looked terrifyingly like a curse. Adaeze continued singing until guards finally reached her and dragged her from her position. Even then, her voice did not stop. She sang while they beat her. She sang while they dragged her through the courtyard. She sang until physical trauma finally closed her throat. But by then, it did not matter. The song had been released. The truth had been spoken. The ancestors, whatever their actual nature and relationship to the world, had heard what had been said in their names, and nothing in the kingdom of Dahomey would ever be quite the same. The aftermath of what would come to be known as the Day of the Stolen Blessing unfolded over months and years. Adaeze was imprisoned, tortured, and eventually executed. Her death designed to be as prolonged and painful as possible, a warning to anyone who might consider following her example. But the warning came too late. The song had escaped the palace. Versions of it spread through the captive networks, modified and adapted, carried across the kingdom and beyond. Other voices began singing it, not with Adaeze's power but with her intent. The message could not be contained. King Kapengla's campaign, which had been the occasion for the disrupted ceremony, ended in disaster. His army was defeated by a coalition of states that had somehow anticipated his attack, that had prepared defenses he had not expected, that fought with a desperation and coordination that seemed almost supernatural. The king himself barely escaped with his life. The kingdom blamed the defeat on the broken ceremony. The ancestors had been offended. The blessing had been stolen. The sacred songs had been corrupted beyond repair. Priests conducted elaborate rituals of purification. Officials hunted for anyone connected to Adaeze's network. The palace singers were interrogated, punished, some executed on suspicion of complicity. But the damage could not be undone. Confidence in the sacred traditions had been shaken. Questions that had never been asked began circulating. If a single foreign captive could disrupt the most important ceremony in the kingdom's calendar, what did that say about the power those ceremonies allegedly contained? If the ancestors could be addressed by anyone, not just the priests and the king, what did that mean for the structure of authority that depended on exclusive access to divine power? Rebellions broke out in territories that had been quiescent for generations. Captives escaped in numbers that overwhelmed the usual systems of control. Neighboring states, sensing weakness, raided territories that had previously been considered secure. The kingdom did not collapse, not immediately, but it began to contract, to struggle, to face challenges it had not faced since its founding. And something else spread as well. The story of Adeze, the woman who had sung the truth before the king and the ancestors, the voice that had become a warning. The story changed as it traveled, as all stories do. Details were added, others forgotten. Adeze became a symbol, a legend, a figure larger than the actual woman who had lived and suffered and eventually died for her resistance. But the core of the story remained consistent. A captive had used her voice to challenge absolute power. She had sung her truth when she was supposed to sing their lies. She had paid the ultimate price but had not been defeated. In the slave ships crossing the Atlantic, people sang versions of her song. In the plantations of the Americas, her story circulated through networks of resistance that connected enslaved people across thousands of miles. Her name became a code word, a signal that identified those who had not accepted their bondage, who maintained hope that resistance was possible, who believed that truth could be spoken even when speaking truth meant death. The kingdom of Dahomey eventually fell, not immediately, not as a direct result of what Adeze had done, but incrementally over the following century. French colonization administered the final stroke, transforming the once proud empire into a subordinate territory. The palace at Abomey became a museum, its glories displayed for tourists, its crimes acknowledged in carefully worded plaques. But the voice that had challenged it continued to echo, continued to inspire, continued to remind everyone who heard the story that power is never as absolute as it appears, that systems that seem invincible contain their own vulnerabilities, that even the smallest sound can become thunder when it speaks the truth. In modern Benin, which occupies the territory of the old Dahomeyan kingdom, there is a tradition among certain families of singing a particular song at funerals. The song has no official name, no recorded origin, no formal place in the nation's musical heritage. It is simply passed from generation to generation, taught by elders to children, maintained through memory alone. The words have changed over the centuries, adapted to modern languages and modern circumstances. But the melody remains recognizable, a distinctive pattern that appears nowhere else, that scholars have been unable to trace to any known tradition. Local people say the song came from a woman who was not from their nation, a foreigner who was brought in chains and who learned to make her chains into weapons, a singer whose voice could speak to the dead and make the dead listen. They say that if you sing the song correctly, with the right intent and the right voice, you can hear her responding. Her voice, still traveling, still echoing, still speaking truth to power across the centuries. Some dismiss this as superstition, as myth, as the romanticization of a history too painful to remember accurately. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps the song is just a song, the story just a story, the woman just a woman who died long ago and has no connection to the present except through legend. But on certain nights, when the Harmattan winds blow down from the Sahara and the air fills with dust and whispers, when the old palace ruins seem to shift in the darkness and the red earth releases its memories, some people claim they can hear something. A voice, a melody, a warning. And they remember Adeze. They remember what she did. They remember that she sang her truth when all the forces of the world demanded her silence. They remember that her voice became a warning. And they know, in whatever part of themselves still believes in such things, that some voices never truly die.